Okay, so what is Dresden? Dresden was a German city and was the 12th most populated city in Germany, which in the US is the equivalent to Jacksonville, Florida. It had a total of 1.2 million people living in Dresden, and almost half were refugees. Dresden was a very cultural place and had many different ethnicities living there, and as you can see in the picture, I have different houses trying to signify that. And Dresden also had a lot of factories geared toward making weapons to like supply their army. And in the picture, you can also see the statue of Martin Luther Vor, and he led a reformation and made one of the three big Catholic religions. And a fun fact, according to Kurt Vonnegut, the author of Slaughterhouse-Five, Dresden was a beautiful city, and the soon to come war made it unrecognizable, and it was completely different afterwards. So that was Dresden before, and this is Dresden after. So a little bit has changed, as you can see. And what happened in Dresden? So the bombing of Dresden took place in World War II on February 13th, 1945 through February 15th, 1945. This is when the British aircraft launched its first attack on the eastern German city of Dresden. In the days that followed, them and their US allies would drop nearly 4,000 tons of bomb on the assault. The reason they did this was that Dresden had a lot of American soldiers held hostage underground. Once the Americans and British discovered this, they planned out how they could attack Dresden to help the American soldiers. Since the hostages were underground, they were safe from any attacks from above, so the American and British decided to bomb Dresden to free the hostages. Not only was bombing Dresden beneficial for freeing the hostages, but Dresden was a key transport junction, and it might have been another reason why it was bombed. On top of this, because the Soviet Union was expanding on territory and becoming a bigger presence, this was a good opportunity to show how powerful the U.S. could be to Russia, and that was another reason why they could have bombed it. Okay, so as you can see in the picture, this is an accurate description of what the U.S. and British did to Dresden. And some fun facts about Dresden is that more people died in the bombing of Dresden than the initial bombing of Nagasaki. And what I mean by the initial bombing of Nagasaki is that I mean the people that actually died from the bombs and not the people that died from the radiation poisoning afterwards from the bombs. And according to the soldiers that were actually held captive in Dresden, once they were released and they actually got freed, they didn't know where they were because the city had been completely leveled, and it was like they just did not know where they were afterwards. And the famous Russian president Vladimir Putin was actually a KGB spy stationed in Dresden during. Mhm. And then during the bombings, they targeted factories and places of high population. And because most of Dresden was bombed to the point of being unrecognizable, to this day there are like a handful of buildings that are left from the war or pre-war. So after the bombing of Dresden, which lasted around 3 days, with tens of thousands of people dead, Germany made efforts to try and rebuild their former landmarks, and around 23% of the city's industrial buildings were either severely damaged or completely destroyed, and along as 50% of its residential buildings were severely damaged or completely destroyed. But the bombing of Dresden is one of the most controversial topics of World War II. Historians to this day still question whether or not the attack was justified, seeming that there were so many refugees there and people that were just not involved in the war and actually just trying to escape the war. And some people say that the Allies committed a serious war crime and it was not necessary, while others, like American and European governments, say it was needed in the war against Nazi Germany. And 75 years later, the bombing of Dresden remains a controversial topic. This concludes the presentation.